One thing I can't live without is my affectionate love for giant robots. I mean, you look at this collection and you can exactly tell, wow, this man has an affection for robots. It's almost like he could sacrifice almost everything else, but the robots, I'll keep them. Please, I am an aficionado when it comes to mechanical design. It's just a code word for graphic design because there was a point in time in high school I have thought about mechanical design as a career path. These centerpieces of art that have been rendered as tangible objects are the mystics of dreams that no one can ever think about. Not only the art of creating them can go underappreciated, but the fact that careful design thinking was applied to such pieces that it blows your mind what these designers were thinking when making the robot. During my lifetime, I was more accustomed to the robots as I was given mostly loose ones from relatives and some from the shops whenever we went into town. Prior to this, the Daizujin was mostly left out of the conscious. I was very well of its existence in MMPR thanks in part to the old VHS releases from Polygram Video and reissues from Fox Home Entertainment. But no product of the Daizujin was made at the time, so having the Daizujin toy and its American production cousin made it quite difficult to acquire, mostly because everyone wants one. Throughout the years, I would question why so many companies including Bandai themselves would come back to the Daizujin more often than any other robot. What makes the Daizujin tick more than the last 13 robots? Then, I started looking at the design documentation for these older robots. Around this time, a lot of Plex old talent have retired or moved on to other departments. The problem around the 1990s is that how could you escape the aesthetic of the 1980s and solidify its era of robots to create a fresh and welcoming aesthetic? Before we investigate the Daizujin, we must look at its inspiration. The Go line. Five-line robot designed by Katsushi Murakami. The Go line itself was an iconic piece of history once again brought over to the attention of the Voltron series. Its simple engineering and structure made the robot so aesthetically pleasing to look at despite being built from the same foundation of previous robots. Largely in part that the design of the Go line was a challenge for Murakami in the initial planning stages. Murakami states that he once decided to divide one line into 5 components. However, he felt that the design similarities between Combattler V and Voltus 5 made it less indistinguishable from the two robots. He therefore settled on 5 lines into one robot. The other roadblock had Murakami thinking about what to exactly do with the hands. Knowing he couldn't integrate proper fists into the combined robot, he settled for the line's fangs and mouth to act as handpieces. A peculiar choice for a robot of this time, as most robots settled for removable fists that were installed during the combination process. More design choices usually included human-like features such as the face, belt and emblem, although in his defense he states that a creature-like robot doesn't look as good as the hero robot. Considering the design choices made by Murakami made for an accidental iconic design outside of Japan, he wouldn't have thought that this design would be reinvented in some way. Although strangely, Murakami's protege, Tsuyoshi Nonaka, thought otherwise. When Nonaka started working at Plex in the late 1980s, he was given design duties on shows like Kiro Keiji Jaban and Tokei Windspectre. The challenges faced by Nonaka were to make design choices that didn't look like it was still from the same time period. In the most extreme cases, Jaban and Windspectre design aesthetics were so similar that they looked like they never left the 1980s. As Nonaka pushed forward his design work in the 1990s, creating designs for Soulbrain, solidifying the 90s aesthetic, he would have been given the second opportunity to work on Toei's Golden Goose, with his previous contribution being Titan Boy for Choshinsei Flashman, which was so successful that Plex later reused the concept in the Machine Robot series twice. For this entry, Nonaka had looked back at his master's work. He insisted that the design for the new robot would be based around one of his master's older works from the 1980s. The remaining artifacts of Murakami's design aesthetic can be largely seen when you compare the robots together side by side. The use of animalistic details on the feet, the addition of human-like features such as the chest emblems, belts, and a head that largely resembles a human head. In earlier concepts, the Daizujin laid towards more of an evolution of the Go line. more aching that he wanted to pay him tribute to one of the most important contributions in Super Robot history. Nonaka would rework this, which results in what we ended up with today, but it never stopped people comparing the two robots as doppelgangers. To their observations, it made sense with the same design philosophies applied to the robots. Compared to the boxy robots that were intentionally the result of the design trends of the 1980s, this really looked like it was born into a new era of mecha. Each component looked more creature-like, which wasn't seen very commonly on the robots of this nature, but it seemed it took a lot of risks to get to this point. But even in Nonaka's sensibilities, he wanted to remake almost everything that he was always in love with, especially the Daizujin. And for many years onwards as a freelance artist, he would continue to work on many iterations of the Daizujin in toy form. Except for this one. And this, outside of the 2020 Megazord, is the only Daizujin that Nonaka was not involved in any progress whatsoever. This is usually a concerning factor when you don't see the confidence in the design choices the later iterations make, because the inheritor is not involved in any development process whatsoever, and not knowing what decisions are going to be made is quite the gamble. For the last decade, we have seen resurgence in demand for the Megazord. Within the last decade, we received the 2010 Zord Builder Dino Megazord, 2013's Legacy Megazord, a repurposed 2010 Megazord that was not designed for diecast in mind, 2017's Soul Chokutin Daizujin, and the Super Minipla Daizujin. Not counting the non-combinable figures, some may quote this as an oversaturation of the Megazord. However, given the choices you have, there is at least some variety in regards to what the demands are in the collector's mind. Unfortunately, all these options are off the market, so the best chances are usually secondhand samples with gouging price tags attached to their novelty. This is on the market, at a price that almost rivals the masterpiece Transformers and most sold Chokukin figures. It's purpose built, and it's something you can walk out the store with. Question is this a really good Megazord? Right off the bat, the presentation is top notch. Every single piece of the box warrants a kiss because it seems that Hasbro wants to sell you the idea that this is the end game when it comes to Megazords. I've never seen such boxes like these in a long time. The last I've seen of this scope was the GX71 Go Line box. The thing is, however, it can be annoying if you're not a box collector. I kinda blame Apple for this really. You buy a new phone and the boxes are somewhat attempting to legitimize itself as a premium product because you paid over $1,000 for it. But let's not go that far. The plastic free packaging can be concerning for some, yet it seems to fit the bill on this release. Everything's in bags, so I don't have to deal with the usual crap like the tag securing items in the box. I hate that shit. So since this is separated out of the box, we can go over the robots one by one. Starting with the Tyrannosaurus, and it does its job looking like the Tyrannosaurus. Not the reptilian species, but the robot named Tyrannosaurus. One of the biggest problems was translating a physical suit to a proportionate size. During the first few episodes, the Tyrannosaurus was always a guy in a suit. Not many toy versions have managed to successfully attempt this look while it had the ability to combine. So I can see why they went the safer route when it came to this particular style of the Tyrannosaurus. Articulation is quite limited, but consider the fact you won't be doing much with this robot. After all, you have a package full of robots to go through. Mammoth is a robot mammoth. In many of the toy iterations over the years, he'd never really got much to do. It's so sad that all Mammoth does is fill the role of the arms. No ingenious engineering is going to make those legs move up and down, but they can move 90 degrees. Intentionally something I forgot. Yes, you do learn something new every day. But one thing that separates the Mammoth from the others is the lack of articulated trunk. I guess the designers knew that the Mammoth wasn't going to be doing much. Triceratops is again to be expected to have less versatility than you would imagine. He has no movable tracks, but that was for the best as rubber doesn't last very long. Even with fake wheels, it won't do the trick. But considering that one of the caveats was to be a leg and not do much, I can get why they didn't go with the chains on the horns. After several legal threats and the removal for safety reasons, it's probably for the best. But even when LEGO is providing you with chain pieces, albeit non-lethal ones, you'll be scratching your head a little. Thankfully this can extend like the prop on the show, and detract whenever you're going to the robot. The cannon works as it always does. You just gotta imagine the lasers. Saber Tiger has exactly the things you want on the saber-toothed tiger. but perhaps being too spoiled over the yellow line really makes me wish that we got more of the Saber Tiger. If it isn't sitting and it ain't got no movable pillars, it ends up becoming a brick. But it's not all doom and gloom. To its benefit, it does look exactly like how it does on the show, with a few added surface details. More on that later. Pteranodon unfortunately has always been the weakest robot in the Daizujin family. That is, if you don't have any imagination at all. Practically, it's a flying machine with guns for feet. But the way it's designed and applied to the Megazord seems like the afterthought that Nonaka somehow forgot there was a 5th ranger that was supposed to go onto the robot. However, to its credit, ends up resulting in a chest emblem that works very well for the design. So since there's a set of accessories, we have fixed posed hands instead of the articulated fingers on the GX72, one to grab stuff and to be used in the transformation, and the other are dynamic open palm hands that are hard to get on because it's cold here. A power sword, which some may mistake for a letter opener, the Mammoth's head to become a shield, and the sets of 1 to 144 scale Power Rangers, which the bases are too large that they go whack on the scale with other 1 to 144 figures. Although with a little bit of elbow grease, they are almost in scale. Can we transform this sucker now? I can see behind my screen that the audience is getting impatient. Dino Tanker is, it's not practical for a tank. I mean, you got lasers coming out of the eyes and the turret can only face forward. It doesn't even have any mobility. And furthermore, how is it standing without any supports? Where's the force that's pushing the tanker out of Megazord mode? This makes absolutely no fucking sense, and it disobeys the laws of physics. I mean, it took them 7 years to figure that out. Yes, it looks like the Dino Megazord. It doesn't deviate from Tsuyoshi Nonaka's vision of the robot. And yet to some, this looks like the drastic departure from the last installments that were released several years ago. But I never owned the other figures, so I can only comment this as a standalone robot. Not only that it's tall, menacing and stoic to look at, some may say it looks less thick than the one on the show. In some cases, the one on the show looks exactly like the 1992 toy. So where does this excel at? I spent hours looking at this. You can't keep your eyes off it because it's demanding you to look at it and admire it. It doesn't take very long to notice that yes, this is a Hasbro toy. Deal with it. I handled plenty of Transformers in my lifetime, mostly ones that Takara had designed. I was used to the heavy ratchets and hefty plastics that were commonplace on Transformers toys. This indeed is strangely fitting for those Transformers toys. Don't believe me? Look at this Grimlock here. Not a definitive example, but let's add more to the mix. Here there are ratchets and heavy plastics. And we were to compare this to another centerpiece, the GX71. Okay, bad example because the GX71 is a masterpiece. How about some other Megazords? The scaling is a bit too off, perhaps too tall to fit with the other mecha. These are usually non-scale, or to my knowledge, they were usually a universal scale that most old deluxe Chogokin toys were when they were booming. This doesn't have any die-cast, but as compensation, its construction is quite solid, being on par with Hashtag Transformers. I never saw the Daizujian as a die-cast piece. It was never really designed to have die-cast unless it was overhauled in its engineering, which in fact it was accomplished with the GX72. But where would you put die-cast in this? Internally would be the easiest answer. Anywhere else without falling down? You wouldn't even be sure. But as a comparison piece to its contemporaries, it starts to fall apart really easily. And this unfortunately has led to the downfall of the Zord Ascension project Megazord. It's 647 grams, you expect more weight from it. Hollow plastic gaps on the Saber Tiger's legs, molding holes on the Pteranodon's wings. Because there's no wheels on the Triceratops, it feels too light for its own good. It's quite light for a mecha of this size. Weird wonky paint application that you have to squint to know it's a piece of crap. Ultimately, a lot of the paint applications are so minor that I can brush it off very quickly, considering that this has been a case-by-case basis on all samples that I've witnessed. Unfortunately, it's been plagued by surface details that not many people can sufficiently, how you can say, have tolerance about. Now you wanted to discuss the elephant in the room. Although to be fair, you already have a completely accurate Megazord that is expensive, and you already have a cheaper option, but the hard part is that these options are no longer on store shelves. It's already hard enough finding either one at a decent price. The creative liberties that have been attached to this Megazord is a tough one to comprehend if you're not used to model kits. This exactly reminds me of when Bandai would reproduce their Gundam model kits via high grade and master grade scale models. None of them were exactly accurate to the animation models that they were based off. That didn't really stop them from having the same silhouette and structure to the reference it was basing itself off. Not only that, you have panel lines and surface details scribed into the robots in a slow attempt to make the models pop more than they should. If I were to believe that these surface details were based on the props, I would beg to differ. The only difference with the model kits is that you can remove these details in favor of creating an animation model look. Sure, it's painstakingly difficult but achievable. Here you have no choice but to live with it, because if you paid top dollar for this robot, you wouldn't even bother going the extra mile to modify your toys. Oh, there's another elephant? Not that one. Price. This in the US costs about $165.99 US. Well, you may ask yourself, what can you do for $165.99? A lot of things actually, but perhaps we put this in analysis on this. GX72 when it first debuted was $299 and the Legacy was $79.99, including the countless reissues. Not counting the fact that this was advertised and marketed as a premium product makes it really easy to judge its pricing based on the merits that it has no die cast and the sculpt is questionable. It's a real middle ground product that slaps itself as the middle shelf option. It goes one way or another. Once again, this is dependent on how you're adequate on robots are. Price was the reason why I never chased for the Legacy or the GX72. The GX72 wasn't a very good SoC release when compared to the rest of the other robots on the line. You can save a lot more to buy a Go Line or a Mazinger Z, and it'll be more enjoyable than the GX72. Legacy was mostly refitted with die-cast, and it was not purpose-built for die-cast metal. Just adding die-cast to an already existing toy doesn't work. because you have to figure out where the weight distribution is going in order for it to stabilize. At the same time, I never had the money for either one. I came into the game way too late. I never cared for either one for the fact that I'd rather buy any other SOC robot than the Daizujin, and the Legacy is a hunk of unacceptable metal rubbish. And I merely forgot the original 1992, for myself and others included that is considered the desired version. But I know for a fact that I will never acquire a 1992 Daizujin under any circumstances whatsoever. Even if I have the money, it's still a no-go. The other Hasbro one doesn't know what it wants to do with it. It's an outlier by any means necessary, and unsurprisingly for those that bought it were mostly left with disappointment. The cheapness on that one does not warrant a $50 price tag, especially if you had to buy each component separately, which was a dirty tactic that Bandai and Poppy had used for several years because box sets are expensive, even as a box set sold exclusively to Amazon, possibly marked up after manufacturing it. To make matters worse, the fact that you had to buy a sticker sheet to make it look better is quite insulting. Repro labels should exist as an alternative, not as a requirement. $79.99 back in 2015 or $299.99 in 2017 may not have been the same back then as it is now. You know why your mum didn't buy you that Optimus Prime back in 1984 even on the Sears catalog that it only costed $20.99. They didn't make $20.99 on a constant basis. $20.99 is like $50 of today's money. Your mom wouldn't pay $50 for a toy truck that will be destroyed and chucked into the bin several years later. It's easy to dismiss price at this age, especially when complaining about a $1 billion toy company. I must admit, if I were around 1996, I would have bought 2 King Pyramidas for the same price of this. But the reality is I wasn't around that time, and I don't have that money now. Those King Pyramidas were at least $500 worth in the box, so why go this route? Did Hasbro really expect people to go on eBay if they didn't like the product? Turns out that strategy worked for some people and then they cancelled their pre-orders. Most people already have better alternatives in their collection, and if they were intending to replace their collections, then they're quite mistaken to do so. I don't blame people for doing it, but rather it's such a common practice in the toy collecting space that it's easy to dismiss. However, this is exactly a step up from the budget Megazord. Well, obviously it has to be. The cheapness is relating to the fact that the GX72 uses better injection molding processes. The GX72 was designed to be premium mind because that's what they've been doing for over 20 years. As a figure itself, it's a solid figure. It's very good at representing itself as an excellent figure. It doesn't need to be a replacement or a substitute. If you have no Megazord or Daizujin, then it's something you want to consider. And it's because I have no Daizujin, I'd cautiously recommend it. I bought this in the name of science. I have become the guinea pig with the rest of the world just typing away about how much they paid for a GX72, and they aren't going to replace it. Same old shit. But when it's clearly marketed and designed to replace your existing Megazord, it falls apart really easily, and if you already have the others, you may not need a replacement. This ends up being those it ain't broke don't fix it scenarios. Unfortunately, due to the hype of the GX72 cementing into the collector's minds, what does this end up achieving? A place in my house, that's for sure, and a lot of rage, that's for sure. Therefore, to finally answer the question, is this a really good Megazord? Perhaps a really good Megazord is an exacerbated scripter. However, I would go as far as to say it's good, not bad. I unfortunately wasn't lucky enough to acquire the other Megazords. Even when they were popular at the time, they just weren't enticing enough to collect. I was already moving on to other peculiar subjects from here on out. From this transition experience, I was more tolerant to keeping my expectancy to an all-time low. Around that time, my collecting goals were to use the secondary market as much as I could. I was born far too late to see the impact of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers had on people's minds. Everything I heard was essentially the same stories going out from people's reconstructed memories. Those points in time that were deemed important to remember. For most people, this was their first Megazord toy. For over 29 years from now, they would have dreamt of something much more larger in scope over what they would love in a Megazord. But I have to ask one question for all collectors. What makes a definitive figure? This is the most preposterous question to date, but you may realize there are many ways to answer this question. But even with the constant revisions and new releases from so many companies all over the world, I can't seem to grasp the concept of definitive if this ends up becoming a never-ending quest to create the best version of a figure. From many forum comments and social media posts all over the world, with bucket lists with so many things with impossible goals to reach, this so-called wishful thinking never gets any designer anywhere. Even with unlimited resources, money can't buy the satisfaction of a collector would like without the sacrifice of hundreds of their hard-earned currency to a product that will be deemed obsolete in the next year. How many years from now are we going to see Bandai, Hasbro, or a third party once again attempt to reconstruct a Daizujin? An unfeasible question unless the approval of Tsuyoshi Nonaka, of course. Otherwise, it almost seems impossible to meet the criterion of needs. As far as its callbacks are concerned, it's acclaimed over its achievements rather than its overall popularity. It really provided the experimental footprints for all Super Sentai series going forward with the design philosophies that were once pioneered by a sole designer. A sole designer that was mesmerized by his master that had shaken the landscape of robot toys.